Greetings and welcome to another installment from the Patchwork Productionz Learn to Crochet for Beginners series. In this video, we will learn some tips for marking rows and rounds. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Stitch, and Patchwork Productionz is all about learning and doing crochet. So make sure you subscribe so you never miss another installment. Without further ado, let's get started. This video is a special one because we won't be making anything, but we'll be covering a very basic topic in crochet and something that will be important for you to be aware of. So hopefully it will be a short video. Basically, I'll be showing you different ways that would be effective for keeping track of your rows or rounds, and sometimes even your stitches. Depending on what you're making, the project you're working on, or if you're making your own project, you're going to want to keep track of how many rows you have in, say, you're working in the row, or how many rounds you have for, say, you're working in the round. Because you need to keep track of which step you're on, how many stitches you need to do, if there are problems, where you need to go back to, etc., and so on. And so there are a couple different ways for going about doing this. Also, occasionally you may be working on a complicated stitch patterny thingy, pattern stitch, whatever you call it. And so being able to mark where you are with the stitches would also be effective. So I'll just show you a few different ways that you can keep track of your rows and rounds, starting with the basics, the traditional. Most people will recommend using a safety pin, which most people can have easy access to a safety pin. Of course, you always want to be careful for this point, and basically what you do is when you're working in the round, or in the row, when you're working in the row, what you'll want to do is, as you finish a row, you will just insert your safety pin into that last stitch and just leave it there to mark it. So that will be able to tell you where the end of your row is, and as you move up in rows, you will be able to move your safety pin, so you could take it out and put in the next row, or if you really need to keep track of how many those are and not know that you're just at the end of a row, you could add more safety pins. Now, let me say that depending on the size of the project, adding more safety pins could get crazy. Because let's say you have a project like a scarf where you're going to have most likely 100 plus rows, depending on how you do it. If you do it on the growing the short side's length instead of growing the long side's height, you're most likely going to have more 100 or more rows. And having 100 or more safety pins could get a little interesting. So in some cases it may not be prudent to do that. Also, if you're following a pattern and simply need to know that you're at the end of a row and not necessarily which row, you could just move the safety pin as you go, and that won't be a problem, because say you could mark where you are, which row you are from a book or online, wherever you got your pattern from. So there are ways to get around that, but just something to keep in mind, that if you need to know how many, you can just add safety pins so long as your project is small enough. But a safety pin is one of your most common ways for marking the rows. You can also use a safety pin in the same way to deal with your rounds. You would simply insert your safety pin at the end of every single round you make, and this, if you're doing the circle round method, I guess I'll call it, where you chain to extend the height before you do the next round, you wouldn't insert it into the chain, you'd insert it into the last stitch made. If you're doing spiral round, you would again insert into the last stitch made. And you would move it up like that. And the same thing applies. If you really need to know exactly how many rows you've done without marking it down somewhere else, you can add more safety pins so long as your project is not too large where that would just get a little hectic. Other than that, every time you finish a round, you move, and you'll know that if you put your project down and come back to it, that you'll know this is the end of a round and I can begin the next round or row, whichever one you're doing. So a safety pin, very easily accessible and common method for marking your rows and rounds. Another one which is kind of random, but frankly you can use anything that can stick in there without disrupting the work. So here I have a bobby pin just as an example of something that can act very similarly to the safety pin, as well as not having any pointy issues where you might get pricked. But this can act the same way where you can just use it to mark where your round, or same principle where your row is, so you'll be able to know that you've finished one section of your project. So this is an alternative. I'm sure a lot of girls will probably have bobby pins around, maybe boys less so. But even if you have something like a paper clip will work very similarly to a bobby pin, and safety clip, uh, safety pin. So any of those will work just fine. Now, a lot of craft stores or places that sell supplies for crochet and knitting will have different products, various products. Here's one that I have. These are actually, they're labeled as stitch markers, but you can use them as round markers as well as stitch markers. So what these can be used for is the same as the safety pins, where when you finish, you just insert it. And these ones, I mean, different ones look different ways. These ones are designed sort of like a horseshoe, so it's just a little plastic loop with a bend in it so that you can move it out and use it. And so you can use this to mark your rows just like with the safety pin. But what you can also do with these, which is why these are called stitch markers, probably, is that if you're crocheting a piece and you're doing a really complicated pattern, you're in the middle of a stitch and you have to stop for some reason, or you're making a pattern. There are some special patterns, like you're making a piece of work where you gotta stop midway and do a different piece before you continue. And so what you want to do is when you stop, you want to mark that stitch that you stopped at, before you move on. Two reasons for doing that. One, you could do it like this, so it will also, let me see if I can get it in here. It'll also protect your stitch from accidentally being pulled out, because you would have put it in there, and then you can just slip it right off and be able to get your crochet hook in there to work again. And also to help you remember which part of the work you needed to come back to after you finished the additional piece. So let's say I needed to, just as a random example, I need to come back and work into this stitch, specifically this stitch, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth stitch from my loop here, and I had to do something else and come back. So I would just stick this right in there, uh, as a stitch marker, and so I'll know when I come back that this was the precise stitch that I needed to work in. So there's several uses for these things, and technically you can use the paper clip, safety pin, bobby clip, whatever you call these things. You can use them all the same way. These are just a little easier because they're not as big. Anyone can get them, and you usually get more of them in a set. I mean, you can get a lot of any of the other things. So these are, as the package says here, stitch markers, and you can use them just like that. So that's another way that you can keep track of your rows, your rounds, or stitches. And again, same thing applies to working in the round. If you need to mark a stitch pattern, mark your round, know exactly where to come back, you can use this, you can insert it, and you'll know exactly where to go. Or you can even insert it right into that loop so that it protects your work from getting pulled out. So there's that as well. Then there's also this unique little thing. I happened to pick up one of these, and this is a stitch or row counter. So it's a little device that basically you stick it on your finger. I mean, technically you don't have to stick it on your finger, but because you're crocheting and stuff, sometimes if you do it efficiently, which I did not do when I was doing this, it was a little awkward, but you would put it around one of your fingers so that as you're working, you can just hit that button, which I'll show you how this works in a second, because I also believe that I did not put that on the right hand. If I'm working like this, I forget how you do it, but you put it around one of your fingers and keep it there so that as you finish rounds and rows and stuff, you can just push that button and be able to keep track. So what this does is it's just a little gadget, and they're not too expensive. Basically, I hope you can see this. So you'll turn this on, and you'll see that there's a number there. And basically all this does is count up tallies. So every push will equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's a reset button that wipes it all and puts it to 0. And also if you wait enough time, this will just automatically turn off. I don't know, it's like probably a couple minutes or something. And this will automatically turn off. So what you can do is, every time you finish a round or a row, you don't necessarily have to put a marker in it, but you can just push this button and know that when you come back, you'll know how much it is. Because also, so I have this at 1, and if I were to let it turn off right now, just leave it there for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes or something till it auto powers off, and then I turn it back on, whatever number it last had, it will show again. So it has like a memory. So basically, if I crochet this is 2 rounds, and I did 2, and I just left this with my stuff, and then I came back the next day and turned this back on, it'd say 2, and I'd know, oh, this was round 2 that I finished, and I could continue working. Same thing with the row. You can mark it like that. You could also use this to count stitches. That can be a little crazy, although I did once use it when I was making a hat. I was kind of making up a pattern as I was going, and I was running into some problems. So I was like, how many stitches do I have? So literally, I knew the sequence that I did around the hat. So I just knew how to multiply it. So I'd finish it, and I would press the button as many times as I knew I would have those stitches, so I could keep track of how many stitches I had when I finished each round, so I could figure out what the problem was and everything. So this is a pretty handy tool. I haven't used it as much, to be honest, but it does work. So this is an option for someone if they want to keep track of how many rows or even how many stitches they've done within their project. So that's another way you can do that. The last way I'll mention is actually something I kind of thought of myself. I may not be the only person who's done this, but it certainly is effective. So basically, all you do to keep track of your rows and rounds, and this kind of only works to keep track of rows and rounds, not like the other things that can do additional fun stuff. But basically, you take a contrasting color yarn. So in this case, this random piece of pink I have is contrasting on both the yellow and the blue. Technically more so the blue than the yellow, but it works. And what you do is, as you finish let's say a row, you would insert this yarn right under that V. So you're not crocheting with it. It's not going to obstruct your work, but it just goes through that under that V. So when you go to crochet the next time, you got to kind of avoid it and not accidentally pick it up. But yeah, basically you just put it there. And what this does is, I'll quickly show you what it would have looked like if I had done this from the beginning. I'm certain I'm not getting these all right, because it's a little harder to do after the fact, especially when dealing with rows. If this were the round, it would have its own set of problems. But the general idea is that when you begin the project, you would start with it after you make your first row. You would put it in, and then as you work, you would put it into the next stitch. So what happens is, for me, this is really easy and I use it a lot because I always know that when there is a bump in my yarn, whenever I see this loop, I know that that's two of whatever I'm working with. In this case, it's 2 rows. In this case, it would be 2 rounds. And so whenever I see a loose end, that's 1. So if I were to turn this way, I would know that I have 2, 4, and then 5 rows. Now I don't think this is 5 rows because I think I skipped some rows when weaving in my yarn. But this is the general principle. Had I done this from the beginning, it would be a lot clearer to see. This probably has like 7 or 8 rows in it, but I don't remember. So basically, this method is a lot easier for me to keep track of and count quickly. Plus, it just uses old scrap yarn, so you don't necessarily have to buy, like, even this wasn't too expensive. It was like $4 or $5 or something. But I wouldn't even have to buy these things or have to look for safety pins. I could just get any piece of yarn that I had that's a contrasted color and just weave it in. Now I will admit that doing this method in the row is a little tricky because unlike the round, you're not ending your rows in the same place. So one row is going to end here, as you can see, and then when I work this next row, it's going to end over here. Which means I'm not weaving in that yarn on this side because that would make a zigzag, be all crazy. I would have to put it into the first stitch of this next row. But when I come back, it'd go into the last stitch of the row I made. So it's a little different dealing with it in the row, but it still works the same way. Now, doing it in the round, this is basically how I make all my stuff in the round. I always use this yarn because it's just so easy to see. Once you make your little beginning circle, you just insert it from the back so that on the second round, when you pull it forward, that's your bump. And so you'll always know every bump is going to be 2 rounds and every loose end is going to be 1 round. And so if I had 3 bumps and a loose end, I know I have 7 rounds. And I can just scale that up to like 20 something rounds when I'm making a hat. So this is a really, really effective method for keeping track of your rows and rounds. I don't know if anyone else has done something like this, and if they have, brilliant. I really like it. I don't know what, I forgot what made me think of it, but I really like it. So there are a couple things for you to, some tips and ideas, different ways that you can keep track of your rows and rounds, mark stitches, and keep track of all of your crochet work. I will also mention, just as a reminder, that when marking rows and rounds, to not mark the foundation row and also your magic circle or chain loop or whatever you use to start your round. That foundation chain isn't a round. It's the row that's worked, the single crochets that you work back into your foundation chain, or the double crochets, or whatever stitch or pattern you're doing. That is your first row. But the actual chains to make the foundation chain, that's not your first row. And the same thing with the round. If I were to do a chain loop where I like chain 4 and join to the first chain with a slip stitch, that's not my first round. The stitches that I work into that chain ring would be my first round. So just always keep that in mind when marking your rows and rounds. So if anyone else has any awesome ideas for how to keep track of rows and rounds, different ways to mark them or mark stitches, let me know in the comments. Love to hear any fun ideas that people have, and also any other gadgets like these that people might know of. Feel free to let me know if you want to see me test them, use them, or show how they work. So any of those, just leave them down in the comments. Other than that, that will be all for this video. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this tutorial and want to learn more about crochet, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another video. Don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up, and also share this video with your friends and family or on social media. And feel free to leave a comment down below. If you have any questions or suggestions or any feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, catch you later.